Most people don't walk into a pawn shop carrying a piece of history, but that's exactly what happened when a woman presented Rick with an antique katana, claiming it was a 16th century ceremonial sword brought back from World War II. From the moment he laid eyes on it, Rick knew he had something special in front of him.
Hello, how can I help you?
Hi, looking to see if maybe you'd be interested in purchasing this sword.
Oh, wow. Are you a closet samurai or something like that?
No.
The blade had a distinct curve, the handle was wrapped in intricate detailing, and the metal gleamed with an aged but powerful presence. If real, this sword wasn't just a collector's piece, it was a relic of an era long gone. But then, things took an unexpected turn.
There was this whole thing called the spoils of war and war prizes. Might sound a little strange now, but it just goes back from thousands of years. I mean, that was part of a soldier's pay. If you went to battle, you got to take a few prizes home. Generally, out of Europe, they would take flutes. I've seen Lugers, I've seen all these other things. One of the big things guys brought back from...
The woman shared a chilling story. A Japanese kid had once translated the inscriptions on the blade, saying it had been used for beheading Christians. Rick raised an eyebrow. He'd seen his fair share of war artifacts, but this was new. Skeptical but intrigued, he knew he needed a closer look.
Can you tell me what this says right here?
Well, he actually did ask a Japanese kid to tell him what the writings meant. The kid said it was a sword used for beheading Christians.
I mean, I have never heard of the Japanese beheading Christians.
Carefully, he unsheathed the blade. Even Chumley, usually the comic relief in these situations, had to admit, the sword looked serious. Jokingly, he suggested it might have beheaded an unruly boss or two in its time. Rick, however, was all business. He had no idea what the sword was worth, and with a piece like this, guessing wasn't an option.
Do you mind if I take it apart?
Absolutely.
Please. There's a little excitement in here. Ooh, check out the blade on that sword. Don't be touching that, Rick. You know better than that. What did I tell you over the years?
What if you taught me?
Yeah.
Enter the expert. The moment the expert examined the tang, the metal part of the blade that extends into the handle, his expression shifted. This wasn't just any katana. It was made in 1863 by a swordsmith named Nagahiro during one of the most turbulent times in Japan's history. It had belonged to the Lord of Choshu, a key figure in the Civil War that shaped modern Japan. The inscription didn't mark it as a tool of religious persecution. It was a battle sword wielded against the enemies of the emperor. That's when Rick knew he had something big on his hands.
Well, let me take a look at the handle with your permission.
Absolutely. That was slick.
Well, it's got some writing on the blade, huh? Seeing anything good down there?
Then came the million-dollar question. How much was it worth? The expert, clearly impressed, delivered the verdict. The sword, despite needing some restoration, was worth around $10,000. The woman's eyes lit up. It was far more than she had expected, but now it was time to negotiate.
Big question, what's it worth?
Well, in its present condition and the fact that it has very high historical value, I'd say this sword is probably worth about $10,000.
The woman offered $5,000, asking if he could make money at that price. That's when Rick did something surprising. He bumped his own offer up to $6,000. Why? Because, unlike the cutthroat negotiations you might expect, Rick wasn't about to rip someone off. He knew this was a good deal for both sides, and he wasn't going to lowball on something so historically significant.
I have to make money on it.
Oh, I realize that. 5? Can you make money at that?
Yeah, I can. I make a little too much money at that. The fact of the matter is, I don't take advantage of people. 5,000 is just too low.
The woman walked away with $6,000 in cash, and Rick walked away with a legendary samurai sword that would soon become one of the most impressive historical weapons in Pawn Star's history. When a man walked into the pawn shop with a collection of over 250 vintage Hollywood autographed postcards, Rick and the team knew they had something special on their hands. The stack included signatures from legends like Babe Ruth, Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe, and John Wayne. It was a treasure trove of Hollywood history, but the big question remained, were they real?
I brought you some autographed Hollywood postcards from the 1950s. We have Babe Ruth.
Whoa. The Great Gambino. It's Bambino.
The seller explained that his great-uncle worked as a grip in Hollywood during the late 1940s and 50s. Over the years, he managed to get celebrities to sign postcards, which he then mailed to his niece, Susan. the seller's mother. The collection had been sitting in a shoebox for decades until he decided to bring it in.
Let's start here. Where did you get them?
My great uncle was a grip in Hollywood in the 50s, and he would have them sign them and then send them to my mom, and she gave them to me.
Okay, he must have done this for a long time, judging by this day.
A good while.
Rick was impressed but cautious. A collection this big was either a gold mine or a well-orchestrated hoax. He needed an expert's opinion. Enter Steve, one of the best autograph authenticators in the business.
I don't even know where to start. Normally I get someone bringing in a signature, not this many at one time.
The thing with this collection is that there's so many of them. I don't know if some, all, or none of these are real. And if they are real, I don't know if they're worth more than the others.
Steve was immediately blown away by the assortment. As he sifted through the stack, he recognized major names: Jimmy Stewart, Paul Newman, Dean Martin, and even Marlon Brando, who was notoriously difficult about giving autographs. Some of the signatures were personalized with dates, making the collection even more valuable.
Here we are today.
That's it.
Wow. I mean, I'm kind of blown away by all this.
And just the fact that they're all dated.
Yeah.
That makes it great.
I mean, actually, I think that's probably the more cool thing.
Then came the bombshell. Elvis Presley and Frank Sinatra were also in the mix, but the real shocker? A Babe Ruth signature, dated just 3 months before his passing in 1948. Not only was it rare, but it was signed in ballpoint pen, something almost unheard of for Ruth.
This stuff is all no good. It was a big waste of my time to stand here and go through this stuff. I mean, that's the unfortunate part about it.
Really?
No. Actually, it's probably one of the best collections I've ever seen.
After carefully verifying the signatures, Steve delivered the verdict. This collection was the real deal, and its value ranged between $8,000 and $12,000. The seller had initially asked for $2,500, but now, knowing its worth, he aimed for $8,000.
He came in here wanting $2,500 for all of them. What do you think they're worth?
That's pretty good. But an amazing collection. When I look at the signatures in here, it's pretty crazy. We're talking Humphrey Bogart, I saw Boris Karloff, Jerry Lewis, Willie Mays.
Rick, however, knew selling these wouldn't be easy. Framing and preserving each piece would be costly, and unloading them one by one would take years. He made a solid counteroffer, $6,000, cash in hand. After a moment of hesitation, the seller agreed. It was a massive win, and he walked away with way more than he expected, though he jokingly considered keeping the final price a secret from his mom.
So we found out a lot, my man. What do you want for them now?
Start at 8,000 then?
I'm gonna be really honest with you. I'm gonna get a lot of money for these when I sell them. But it's gonna take years and it's gonna take money. As great as it is to have Babe Ruth's signature,
Some items come into the Pawn Stars shop that are just cool, and then there are the ones that make history. This was the latter. A man walked in holding what he called the original management contract between Brian Epstein and the Beatles. If real, it wasn't just memorabilia. It was one of the most important documents in rock and roll history.
I actually got one of the most important documents in rock and roll history. The contract between Brian Epstein, who was the manager, and the Beatles, creating the partnership between the two.
Rick's eyes lit up. This deal gave Epstein 25% of the band's earnings and ultimately set them on the path to becoming legends. It even had the signatures of Paul McCartney's and George Harrison's parents because, at the time, they were under 21. This was the real deal, at least the seller claimed.
What's really unique, it had to be signed by two of the parents, James McCartney and Harold Harrison, because at the time, both of them were under 21.
All right, what you have here is it's pretty incredible. Obviously, you want a lot of money for.
Then came the moment of truth. The man didn't hesitate. $1 million. Rick's face said it all. That was a staggering price, even for something as legendary as this. He wasn't about to gamble that kind of money without verification, so he called in an expert.
That's a lot of money. I'm gonna call my guy. I just want to make sure everything is 100% cool before we start talking price. You know, I can imagine someone spending a ridiculous amount of money to make a brand new one of these.
When the authentication started, the tension in the room was thick. The expert examined every detail: the ink, the handwriting, the overlapping strokes. Every sign pointed to the same conclusion. It was legit. Rick was relieved, but also knew something else. Just because it was real didn't mean it was worth $1 million.
I'm looking for overlapping.
And the overlapping is where it gets dark.
Yeah, it starts to get darker. You could see one pen stroke go over the other. I see no reason to believe at all that this is printed, it's not a stamp, it's not a copy or anything. These are definitely lighters, so that's a good thing.
Okay.
It's a very good thing.
Absolutely.
That's when the expert dropped the hammer. I'd value this at around $500,000. The seller wasn't happy. He argued that history alone made it worth more, but Rick knew better. Memorabilia like this didn't always hit their estimated value at auction. He made his offer, $350,000, cash, right then and there.
All right, so you're still stuck at $1 million?
I really got to get $1 million.
I don't see
We're talking
it.
about history here.
You know, and when you start talking that money, there's very few people in the world that have that much money.
The seller shook his head. He was convinced he could get 7 figures if he took it to an auction house. Rick, not one to overpay, didn't budge. The deal was dead. The man walked out, still holding his legendary contract.
Incredible offer, but I'm really gonna have to stick to $1 million. I could probably take it to one of the major auction houses tomorrow, and I really believe that I could probably get $1 million reserve on this.
Okay, you take the risk. I would go 350. That's cash right now.
And Rick? He watched him go, knowing full well that what something's worth and what someone will actually pay are two very different things. But being this close to the original Beatles contract, that's something. Some items walk into the shop and immediately turn heads. A Egia Zirkulent Zajat Vankilench Fender Stratocaster? That alone is enough to make any guitar enthusiast take notice. But when the seller claimed that this particular guitar had once belonged to the legendary Jimi Hendrix, the stakes shot through the roof. Rick wasn't just interested. He was electrified. If true, this wasn't just a guitar. It was a piece of rock and roll history.
Something in here you're really gonna like to see.
Okay.
1963, American-made Fender Stratocaster.
Oh, to me, this is the guitar.
But there's something very, very special about this specific guitar.
All right.
This guitar was actually played by Jimi Hendrix.
The seller, oozing confidence, laid it all out. According to him, this guitar had been used in Hendrix's studio recordings, passed down from a sound engineer who worked closely with the rock icon. He even had a magazine article mentioning the guitar and a letter from Hendrix's own brother. It all sounded great, but Rick had seen enough forged letters and shaky provenance stories to know better than to take things at face value.
And where did you get this?
It was actually owned by a guy named Skip Jarrett. There was a studio called Juggy Sound Studio that Jimmy loved to cut in up in New York. Skip was the chief engineer at Juggy Sound Studio.
To get the hang of things, Rick asked the seller how much he was willing to sell the guitar. Rick's admiration soon turned to caution when the seller called $750,000. This is a piece of history, all right, but he needs confirmation.
How much do you want for the guitar?
I think this guitar, you know, from everyone I've talked to, I'd be willing to take, say, $750,000 for it.
Before talking numbers, Rick did what he does best, called in an expert. When the guitar specialist arrived, he meticulously examined every inch of the instrument. The details started to line up. The serial number checked out. The wear and tear matched Hendrix's signature left-handed playing style, and even the vibrato arm showed signs of his unique modifications. The expert's verdict? This was, without a doubt, a guitar that had been in Jimi Hendrix's hands. Rick was holding rock history.
I want to make sure this is 100% before we start talking a lot of money.
Yeah, you mind if I take a look at it?
No, man, by all means, that's why you're here.
There's a couple things you'd want to look at. The tremolo bar. These are usually bent and angled up.
When Rick asked the expert what he thought the guitar was worth, the expert did something clever. It's not every day you get to play the same guitar that Jimi Hendrix played. As for what the guitar is worth, the expert estimated anything from $750,000 to $1 million.
In my head, I think I know what it's worth, but what do you think?
No guitar is worth anything unless everything's working on it, in my book.
Plug it in, let it rip,
Let's
just
do
turn it
this.
up loud.
Cannot believe this.
So $750,000 it is. The seller wasn't budging, and Rick knew that while this guitar was valuable, moving it wouldn't be easy. Auctions, fees, and finding the right buyer would all take time. He threw out an offer, $450,000. The seller scoffed. They went back and forth, Rick pushing to $550,000, the seller insisting on his bottom line of $750,000.
At a personal level, I absolutely love it, but you have to find the right auction. It has to be advertised in the least amount of time would be a year, most likely.
Right.
Let me give you $450,000.
$450? Man.
My thing is, I take all the risk, you walk away with cash.
Rick wanted it, but he knew when to walk. He shook his head, thanked the guy, and let him walk out the door. As much as he loved the guitar, he wasn't about to gamble that much cash on a long-shot auction. It was a tough call, but even for a piece of rock history, Rick knew the golden rule: never overpay. Most people clean out old drawers hoping to find a couple of forgotten bills or maybe some loose change. Nothing too special. But when one woman dusted off an old brooch her grandmother had given her years ago, she had no idea she was holding a hidden treasure.
Yeah, I found this. I was cleaning out some drawers and stuff. My mother gave it to me years ago. and I was wanting to find out how much it was worth.
This thing looks crazy. What is it?
It's a Black Widow.
Is it poisonous?
She walked into Pawn Stars expecting a modest offer, maybe a few $1,000. What did she get instead? A jaw-dropping moment that had even Rick questioning his own conscience. At first glance, the brooch looked interesting. Shaped like a Black Widow spider and covered in sparkling stones. Nothing too crazy, right? But Rick knew better. One look and he realized this wasn't just some costume jewelry. It was something far more valuable. When he flipped it over and started examining the details, he dropped a bombshell. This was a Fabergé piece.
Do you know what you have here?
No, not at all.
This is Fabergé. Fabergé was one of the most famous jewelry designers in the world. I mean, he was the jeweler to the Russian court. This is something right here.
For those unfamiliar, Peter Carl Fabergé wasn't just any jeweler. He was the mastermind behind the legendary Fabergé eggs, creating some of history's most exquisite, sought-after treasures. His work was synonymous with royalty, luxury, and craftsmanship so elite that anything bearing his name was worth a fortune. And this brooch? It was pre-revolution Russian imperial jewelry. Real platinum, onyx, diamonds, sapphires, and ruby eyes. Every inch of it screamed pure opulence.
When people say Fabergé, they mean Peter Fabergé, one of the greatest jewelers of all time. This guy became famous for his Fabergé eggs, but he actually made everything from silverware to necklaces to rings.
The woman had been hoping for maybe $2,000, a quick cash out for something she thought was just a pretty trinket. Rick, usually one to haggle hard, surprised everyone. He didn't even play games with this one. With a straight face, he made an offer that sent shockwaves through the pawn shop. $15,000.
What did you want to do with it?
I want to get rid of it.
And how much were you looking to get out of it?
Couple thousand.
Okay. I would really like to give you like $2,000 for it, but unfortunately I have a conscience.
Her reaction? Absolute disbelief. The moment felt surreal, like winning a mini lottery at the counter. But instead of grabbing the cash and running, she tried to push her luck. Rick, shaking his head, stood firm. Then she tried again. Still, no budget. Rick, ever the businessman, made it clear. This wasn't an item that would sell overnight. It was a rare piece, but it required a very specific buyer, meaning it could sit in the shop for months or even years. Despite that, he was still willing to pay $15,000 right then and there.
Oh my God, you gotta be me.
No, I'm not. This is stuff you do not see every day.
How about 17? A man that's willing to pay 15 will definitely pay 17 for that.
No, he won't.
After a bit of back and forth, the woman finally relented. The deal was sealed at $15,000, and she walked away in shock, still processing what had just happened. And Rick? He was left shaking his head, knowing he could have easily walked away with a much bigger profit. But sometimes, even in Vegas, honesty wins.
All right, you're a good man.
Okay.
Thank you. Oh my God, I'm so shocked. I mean, I couldn't believe it was worth $15,000. I hit the jackpot today.
Some items carry more than just monetary value. They hold history, tragedy, and a legacy that transcends generations. So when a seller walked into the shop claiming to have the car that Tupac Shakur was shot in, it was one of those moments when the room went silent. This wasn't just another collectible, but a relic from one of the most infamous nights in music history.
What can you tell me about Tupac?
One of the greatest artists ever to live.
Some guy says he has the car that Tupac was shot in.
This is probably like one of the most iconic cars ever, Rick.
Rick was skeptical but intrigued. A piece of hip-hop history like this? If it was legit, it could be worth a fortune. But there was one major problem. How do you even put a price on something like this? The seller came prepared. He had all the paperwork, tracing the car's ownership back to Death Row Records, with proof that Tupac himself was in it that fateful night in Las Vegas. The black 7 Series BMW had been cleaned up, but the bullet holes once riddling the frame, patched over. It was surreal.
I mean, Tupac probably wrote some poems in this thing.
I know it's an extremely huge deal, but...
I know what you're thinking. Those rims aren't big, but in 1996, boy, those things were huge.
They look huge to me.
Warwick, the show's go-to music memorabilia expert, was called in, but even he admitted that hip-hop collectibles hadn't yet exploded in value like rock and roll artifacts had. That didn't mean it wasn't valuable. Far from it. Warwick pointed out that Tupac's Hummer had already sold for $200,000, and this car? It was on another level entirely. The potential was there, but the question remained. Who would buy it?
So, is there a market for this?
Well, in the memorabilia market, hip-hop and rap, it's not yet taken off as a collector. So I'm going to put this in the same range as Tupac's Hummer, which made $200,000.
All right, thanks, man.
You're welcome.
The risks were huge. Unlike a celebrity-owned car that people could actually drive and enjoy, this wasn't just any BMW. It was a crime scene on wheels. It wasn't about luxury, nostalgia, or performance. It was about controversy.
This is an interesting piece of history. We're talking about it's one car that signifies so much in pop culture that took place.
What happened in this car changed history?
To bring it up to your date and age, this is the Jimi Hendrix of hip-hop.
I keep on feeling older and older today, just so you guys know.
This is crazy. Last time I saw this car was back in '96.
Then came the real shocker. The seller wasn't just asking for 6 figures. He wanted $1.5 million. Rick nearly fell over. That was a massive ask. The seller tried to justify it, revealing he had already turned down an offer of $900,000 from an overseas buyer.
Well, what do we think?
How much you want for the car?
We're actually asking $1.5 million.
Whoa.
It's a big number.
Yeah.
I've actually already had an offer at $900,000 from a guy overseas.
And you didn't take it?
We did not take it. We turned it down. We think there's money there. What do you think, Chum?
That meant someone out there believed in the car's worth. But was it enough for Rick to bite? Rick weighed his options. He knew that if the right buyer came at auction, this thing could go for anywhere between $200,000 and $1 million. But that was a gamble, and Rick doesn't gamble. In the end, he walked away. Chumley was stunned. This was Tupac. How could Rick pass up such an iconic piece of pop culture? But for Rick, it was simple. The price was just too high. At least, if nothing else, he walked away with a rare moment, getting schooled on hip-hop history by Chumley. It's not every day that someone walks into a pawn shop claiming to have money that doesn't even exist, but that's exactly what happened when a man strolled in, confidently presenting what he called a $30 bill. Chumley took one look at it and immediately raised an eyebrow.
Hey, how you doing?
Now, I brought in something I thought maybe you'd be interested in.
What do you have?
I've got a $30 bill made by the United States.
Let me see this thing.
Absolutely.
This looks like a $20 bill to me.
It does. And that looks like a 10.
Now it looks like a $10 bill.
At first glance, it seemed normal, until he realized it had the front of a $20 bill and the back of a $10 bill. Chumley had seen plenty of printing errors in his time, but a hybrid bill like this? That was something else. He had owned the bill for years, but now he was ready to part with it.
The reason I'm going to sell it now is because it has no immediate place in my collection, and I don't see it having a place in the near or long-term future.
The seller, a currency collector, was dead serious about the value. He was ready to sell for a cool $35,000. Rick nearly choked. 35 grand for a bill that technically wasn't even real money? He had to be sure. With a price tag that high, there was no room for mistakes.
How much are you looking to get?
I guess I'm looking for $35,000 on this.
That's a lot of money for 30 bucks.
It is.
Chumley called in an expert to verify its authenticity. When the specialist arrived, his eyes lit up. This wasn't just any misprint. It was one of the most dramatic errors in currency history. In 1974, a handful of these misprints had slipped past quality control, with the Federal Reserve scrambling to recover them. Only around 26 had ever made it into collectors' hands.
This bill is Series 1974. When they were discovered, I believe the Fed came in, they heard about them, retrieved as many as they could, but around 2 dozen, I'd say maybe 26, 27, escaped. Well, it's obviously certified, so you probably don't have any questions on condition.
Then came the big question. What was it actually worth? Depending on the market, the expert estimated an auction value of $30,000 to $40,000. That meant the seller's $35,000 asking price wasn't unreasonable. But here's the thing, that's auction value. Rick doesn't buy at full market price. He needs room for profit, so he threw out his offer, $20,000.
So how much do you think this is worth?
I'd put an auction value, I would expect us to bring between 30 and 40,000. 40 on the greatest day, 30 on an average day.
Okay, well, I think that's what I need to know.
All right, I appreciate it. My pleasure. The $30 bill error is extremely sought out by collectors.
The seller didn't budge. He countered at $27,500, but Rick wasn't having it. The negotiation was heating up. Rick went up to $22,000, his final offer. The seller stood firm at $25,000. And just like that, the deal fell apart.
Plenty of profit potential there, 20. That's just not going to work for me. How about 27.5?
This is going to be my last offer, max value that I can pay for it here. I think if I offer you $22,000, I think there's enough room in there for me to make the profit that I need to make.
The seller walked away, convinced he'd get the full $30,000 to $40,000 elsewhere. As for Rick, he wasn't about to overpay for a bill that technically wasn't even supposed to exist.